Thank you so much for that introduction, Catherine. It's an honor to be here, I have to say. And I have to say it's also sort of awesome in the literal sense of that word. That is, I find it awe-inspiring to be in your company. Because for all the reasons, the obvious reasons, you are such a powerful group. And I just feel honored to be able to touch the group in any way at all. So it's a privilege for me and an honor, and I hope I can add something to your conversation. It's an important conversation, and I actually think that right now we're at, I hope, a really important time in this conversation. And it might sound a little bit strange to hear this coming from me, but you know, I hate teacher evaluation. I just hate it. So okay, we have to do something with that. But the reason I hate it is not because it's not important to do. Of course we know it's important to do. I mean, we're public schools and we take public money and the public has a right to expect good teaching. And every superintendent needs to be able to say to his board and to his community, everybody who teaches here is good, and here's how I know. I've got a system, and if I have hired somebody by mistake and they're really underperforming, we do need to do something about that, either help them get better, good enough, or help them find another career. So it's not as though it shouldn't happen. But we have been sucked into this vortex of numbers and ratings and rankings, and I just hate it. And I know the state, and who knows, it might be represented in this room, it shall go nameless at this point, that wants its ratings of teachers to be accurate to the 13th decimal point. Why on earth? I mean, really. So anyway, so I think we've gotten sucked into this, and we have to always remember this has been well-intentioned in general. I don't think people, well, to the extent that people are putting policies, you know, that are backfiring all over the place, isn't because they were trying to do harm. I think they were actually trying to do the right thing. But net effect is that we've got a lot of screaming out there, and I hate it. So, but let me just give you just a tiny 2 slides worth of sort of background about how we got here. I'd like to bring up to date on some work I'm doing, and then would like to try out on you an idea that I'm working with that is very early days, and I would love your feedback. So, and it has to do with this nexus of quality assurance that we have to have systems that ensure good quality. And though, can we have those same systems or parallel systems that do the important work, which is helping people always be improving in this, what is admittedly enormously complex work of teaching. So, let's just remember how we even got here, and it'll probably help if I turn this thing on a little bit. Okay, so, you know, this whole movement started about 5 years ago, right? With the publication of the widget effect report. That was the new teaching projects report, and on the left it summarized what they did was surveyed a lot of districts around their teacher evaluation practices, and found that the vast majority of teachers were being evaluated at the highest level of whatever was available, like outstanding or superior or whatever. And these are the results for Chicago and Akron, but they were pretty representative. So enormous numbers of teachers and percentages, the size of the bubble shows that, who were terrific, and then down to some much smaller numbers, in some cases 0 teachers whose performance was judged to be unsatisfactory. And so that would be good news, obviously, right? If it were true. But these results were received with the skepticism you could expect by policy people and legislators, and they said, well, it's probably not the case that we have great teaching going on, but in some of those same schools, there are kids who have not learned to read and who are clearly not getting good. Now, and granted, the quality of teaching is not the only influence on learning, but it is clearly a very important one. So this is probably not true. But then what they also found was that not only was it not working for students, it wasn't fair to teachers either. And this was those same results for Los Angeles, and that big circle is all the teachers in LA. The blue part of the circle, almost all of it, are those teachers in Los Angeles whose own performance was judged to be at the satisfactory level or better. Almost all of them. But that little yellow sliver are teachers whose own performance was assessed to be unsatisfactory. If you pull them out and look at them and blow that up, that circle over on the far right, the green part of that circle are those teachers in LA whose own performance was judged to be unsatisfactory, but whose students outperformed the students of the teachers in the blue. So even though almost no teachers were ever thought to be unsatisfactory, some of them were actually getting great results with kids. So this threw everybody back on their heels a little bit and said, okay, right, clearly it's not working. And, on the good news side is that people have also concluded, well, this is a low bar. Teacher evaluation is not being done well, and let's get better at it. And in fact, that was such an important sort of conclusion of all this work that it had enormous, as you know, enormous impact on the guidelines for Race to the Top applications. In order to even apply to get that money, states had to make a commitment to improve their strength and their teacher evaluation systems, and some of them, as you well know, because you're in some of the states that did it, they did that to comply. It's amazing what happens when you put $4 billion on the table. It gets people's attention. And they said, oh, okay, whatever it takes, we'll do it. Well, then, of course, some of these state legislatures are filled up with people who are not teachers, they're not educators in any way, and so they just sort of assume that what works in their hauling business or something would work here. And I'm not being hauling. I mean, we need good moving people, but it's not the same. So they passed these laws that were, some of them being to be implemented by next Tuesday. And then another provision in the Race to the Top sort of guidelines was that some significant portion of the teacher's evaluation has to be based on results of student learning. And we could spend the rest of the day talking about that, which we won't, partly because I'm not qualified to do so. But a lot of the policies that have been put in place in many places simply don't pass the common sense test. And that's my first rule of thumb. Now, but clearly the extent of student learning is an important measure of the quality of teaching. There's no doubt about that. The question always, and it has not been satisfactorily answered, is what counts as evidence and how can you attribute that evidence to individual teachers? That's the challenge. And so far as I know, no one on the planet has answered that question. I mean, really. And I'll tell you one way I know that. They call me. We know. And in truth, the measurement people don't know how to do it, right? I mean, let me give you one homely little example. That let's just say I teach 4th grade and the reading scores went up this year. It's great. I'm happy. The principal's happy. The parents are happy. I mean, we're all happy. The problem is we don't know it was me. It might have been the reading teacher in the building. Probably was. It might have been last year's teacher who taught these kids some strategy. Right? There is no way to sort that out. It just doesn't exist. There's no amount of number crunching that can answer that question of who actually made that happen. So, and then you play it out in other sources. So you can find articles all over the internet as to why the use of standardized test scores is not a very valid measure for individual teacher performance. And and there are plenty of people who really know all the psychometric reasons for that. But let's just take this one more sentence and go a little bit deeper and say, let's say I'm teaching fourth grade, let's say he's my principal. I want to be able to convince him that my kids actually did learn something this year, right? We didn't just have pizza parties all year. I mean, the question's always the same one. What counts as evidence, and how do you know it was me? Well, I can think of all kinds of good answers to that question. How about writing samples from September and May? Or like, and so if we have that conversation together, these are the conversations we should be having about student learning and what it looks like and how we know it and where it's not quite going as well as we want it to. And if we do that as the entire fourth grade team, so much better. So I do think this focus on outcomes measures for students as a reflection of teaching qualities is not such a bad thing. If we don't get sucked into this vortex of numbers. You know, I mean, it's just the case that not everything that's important can you put a number on. So anyway, I'm going to leave that aside because it's, as I say, it's above my pay grade. But there are real experts who are puzzled by this and haven't really quite figured it out. But it doesn't stop the legislators, I've noticed. And that's what troubles me about it. Because real people are really getting hurt based on this. And so when I said at the outset, I hate teacher evaluation, that's why. It's not that I think we shouldn't be doing it and some good can't come of it, and it has. And I'm honored that a lot of places have adopted my framework and said, well, we got to base an evaluation system on something, let's use this. And I love that if they use it as a foundation for conversation and for all of the things that we know promote learning. We know that. And what are those things, right? They are self-assessment, reflection on practice, and professional conversation. That's what we know. And a culture, and this is where your role, as much as anybody's, plays a role. Within a culture of professional inquiry. That is, teaching is not something you learn to do in college and then never have to learn anything more. Right? It's an ongoing quest to get better and to learn more and to learn about kids and how they learn and what's a better way to teach X and how can I get the kids excited in whatever it is. And so there is work here to be done always. And to the extent that it can be led by teachers and teacher leaders, it is better. It's not about bureaucratic top-down anything. It's about conversation around the substance. And I will just mention one last thing on teacher evaluation, and I'm going to get out of it, which is that when my book was first published, I started getting emails and phone calls and a letter. Do you actually remember letters? We used to do letters. I haven't had one for a long time. Anyway, letters. Anyway, so I was contacted by a large urban school district, I think in New Jersey actually, who wanted to revise because what happened, the book came out, and a lot of people said, it tumbled out of everybody's mailbox, and I got all these letters and saying, oh, thank you for writing this book. Now we have our new teacher evaluation system. And I had to break the news to them and say, well, actually, no, I'm sorry, you don't. All you have is a description of good teaching. I hope that'll be useful to you. But it's, no, a system, a teacher evaluation system has a lot of other pieces to it. Like you have to have procedures and decisions about, okay, how do you know if somebody's doing these things or not? It's observations and artifacts and training and a bunch of things. So, no, you don't have a system yet, although this could be part of the system. Well, one big urban district had a better system. It was top-down, punitive, arbitrary, gotcha sort of system. And they contacted me and they wanted to revise it, which it definitely needed, and they wanted to base it on my book. And they were asking my permission. And I said, well, sure, just say where you got it, you know, not everybody does that. And so, okay, so they revised their system, and based on my book, and I was not part of it, but they, so they developed their new system, they implemented it, and you know what? It was top-down, punitive, arbitrary, gotcha. I mean, all they did was exchange one set of evaluative criteria for another. they did nothing to change the culture in the school around evaluation and to make it be anything like a professional experience, right? It wasn't. Well, I only found out about this because I got a phone call from National Public Radio. Now, I'm an NPR junkie. I recognized Javier Sanchez's voice on my machine before you know that. They were doing a story, and they thought I might know something about it. And because, if you remember, I said, say where you got it, my name was all over the darn thing. That's why they were calling me. So I did not know anything about it, but that's what made me realize that if I didn't actually do something, my name would be associated with things people hate. And how's that a good career move? So I then really took seriously and talked to a lot of people. Because when I had been teaching, I never had a good teacher evaluation process. It was just sort of dumb. And I think that's, right? Somebody comes in and does something, and then you have a little conversation, and it goes away. And it was never used as a vehicle for doing any good, for sure. And nor bad, by the way. There wasn't a lot of harm being done in these nothing systems, as far as I knew. I'm sure you had to encounter it. But that's not the case today. There is harm being done. And when some of these jurisdictions rate and rank and then publish the rankings in the newspaper, people should be shocked, honestly. Think about that for a moment. Because have you seen the research on that? That is, you can do that one year, and then you do it the next year, and the rankings are completely different. Because there's so many things, it's just nuts what we're into. So I think it's time to take a very, very deep breath and stop. And I'd be curious to hear from your point of view whether you think this is happening in the places you know about. I think it is beginning to happen in some places where a lot of people are saying, oh, right, this is actually sort of dumb what we're doing. But here's the context I'd like to offer to you. We know from that widget effect report that we have not been very good. And you can see inside those bubbles, everybody was perfect, right? Everybody was a great team, and that's probably not true. And so we can get better, and we've learned how to do this in my group and through some other work we've done. We have learned how to get better at actually figuring out how skilled a teacher is in their practice. Okay. So we can get better at figuring out where everybody is on this curve, if that's what you want to do. We now have to do that now. But you know what? We can do that to the 13th decimal point, and really in the end, who cares? That's not, you only do that so you can move the curve. And if you can't move the curve, if we don't move the curve, 10 years from now, I can imagine we'll still be here, and we'll know where everybody is, but teaching hasn't gotten better. Kids aren't learning more, and the public could be forgiven for asking, what is it actually you did with all that money? We can't move the curve. So I'm putting all my energy these days into figuring out how we use the structures that school districts are required to do for teacher evaluation to use it for real professional improvement. Because it's not as though we're perfect at teaching. We've never claimed that, at least I have. And I'm sure you have either. So it's not that there aren't things to learn. There are plenty of things to learn. But what we don't need are evaluation systems that intrude and interfere with that learning. And in fact, ideally, they should contribute. So, okay, now that's one whole line of work. The other whole line of work has to do with the fact that the ink wasn't dry on these new teacher evaluation systems when all of a sudden here comes legislation around the Common Core. And so here we've had various reactions to that. Now, we could talk for the rest of the day also about Common Core and what's going to happen there. Bottom line, though, let's not forget what the big ideas are around the Common Core, which is that they are an attempt to establish for us as educators a much higher standards for what kids should learn and be able to do, as prelude to both careers and for further knowledge, further education. I don't think any of us would argue that those are bad things to do. And what it's actually making us think about is to make available and have systems that deliver on very high standards of learning for all students, not merely the sort of elite. And I don't know if you've looked at some of the test patterns that are being developed, and I mean, they're hard. In fact, I sometimes wonder if I would pass a test based on them. And they're not trivial things, like at all. And now, whether or not the system can pull it off, I mean, you probably saw they did some pilot testing last year, and in New York City, the percentage of kids who actually passed plummeted to something like 31%, like half the percent, lower than half of the percent of the kids who had passed on the previous tests. And of course that, people scream, and that kind of raised attention, as it should have done. But whether or not the political system can withstand an outcome where kids do so poorly is, I think, another question. That's one question that has to get answered. I'm not sure that our system can sustain it, frankly. So that's one issue. And then the other issue has to do with the uninformed, and in some cases seemingly deliberately misinformed, political debate about the content understandings themselves. The third question, which I think is very valid, is the use of the assessment results in terms of teacher evaluation. And, you know, as a friend of mine says, if we were a sensible country, we would have done this over 12 years. Like right in my new state. We've never demonstrated that we're a sensible country in things like this. And so it's on by next Tuesday, right? And by the way, the tests aren't ready yet, but never mind. And I mean, all that's just so nuts. And that creates a lot of angst. Of course it does, sort of, in my view, unnecessarily. So I honestly do believe that the right thing to do here is to try to retool to these higher standards. And I do think that that's worth doing, because they're great. But we've been having to do all these things simultaneously. Now, most schools and school districts have seen these two initiatives sort of like this, as a, oh my God, a train wreck. You know. Now, other places have taken a slightly different view and said, well, let's just think of them as two parallel tracks. That they both take a lot of energy, and we're doing them simultaneously, which is hard on us, but, you know, they are, you know, we can do two things at once. We're smart people. A project I've been working on for the last year and a half or so is trying to view them a little bit differently as merging. That is, can we design a teacher evaluation system that simultaneously assesses teacher performance, describes and then assesses teacher performance on the kind of teaching that would lead to high levels of student learning. Now, there are a few things to say here. One is, and by the way, I'm just going to call this Common Core as a shorthand. I'm well aware that in plenty of states, because of their own political pressure, they're sort of changing the name. And so they have the Arizona state standards, and they're sort of identical to the Common Core, but they have given them the name Arizona. This is how I'm not sure whether they actually changed the substance, but I know they've changed the name. So whatever, right? But the idea is they're higher standards, and they are standards for student learning. Now, my framework for teaching, of course, has to do with what teachers do. And so we can try to sort of align them, but they are talking about different things. So that's the first thing to always bear in mind. The second thing to bear in mind is that the framework for teaching, as you almost certainly know, is a generic description. That is, it's all teaching. It's all levels. It's all subjects. I'm trying to distill those aspects of teaching that are common across all contexts. The Common Core state standards, of course, are by definition discipline and level specific. So not only are they different from any instructional framework in that they're about students and not teachers, they are about specific content and level. And so that is an important part of the context here so what I've been trying to do is to ensure that my framework, if teachers are teaching well according to it, then their students will do well as measured by Common Core assessments. Now we have earlier data on that. That is, the earlier versions of the framework have been validated on the old tests, and even not very good tests that we've had, because it's all we had. And so we do have good validation data from the framework for the 2011 version of the framework. What I did then in the last couple of years was to go through that 2011 version of the framework with a fine-tooth comb and try to ensure that the big ideas of the Common Core were embedded. And I'll show you just one second how I did that and what I did. But let's just say, I want to say one more sentence about the Common Core. It is an answer. It's a new answer to a question we've always had, which is when the student walks across the stage and collects the diploma, what claim are we making? That is, what does that diploma represent? What are we saying that the student knows and can do? Now, we have traditionally had answers to that question, and the answers have been 4 years of English, 3 years of math, right? They've been that kind of answer to the question. In some states, the answer to the question has also been, and the student has passed a low-level basic skills test. That's been the answer to the question. Right? The Common Core is asking us to ask and answer that question very differently. To say, anybody who collects this diploma is able to do much, much more difficult things than we've ever done before. That's not an insignificant effort, and I believe it's a worthwhile outcome if we can pull it off as a system. And I do think this is something that's going to take everybody, all of us, all of you, people in the policy world, absolutely practitioners, to do this. And it's not a small task for reasons I'll just try to explain. So we, the Danielson group, and working with a couple of close colleagues, were awarded a grant from the Helmsley Charitable Trust. Now this is, as in Leona Helmsley. Do you remember That's not intended as a laugh line, actually. Yeah, I sort of thought she gave it all to the dog. Well, evidently not. Evidently not. And I'm not mocking, I'm really not mocking this, because there's a lot of money there and they make big grants to worthwhile causes. But who knew, right? I mean, it's pretty funny. But anyhow, they awarded us a good sized grant, $7 million, to answer some questions. That is, and I'll just summarize what's here. We formed a little partnership for this project with a group called Student Achievement Partners, which you may have encountered them. And that's a little nonprofit group that was, actually it's not tiny. They were founded by David Coleman and Susan Pimentel, who were the main authors, or at least coordinated the work of writing the Common Core statement. And so, and they, SAP, Student Achievement Partners, had drafted what they call instructional practice guides. That is, little observation tools to look specifically for instructional practices that in their judgment, would promote Common Core learning. And so what we did, we worked with 4 school districts and taught them, or they taught them, how to use their guides. And these were school districts that were already using my framework. And so we asked them to, in some cases they were paired observations, in some cases they were just sort of one at a time, but with the same teachers, to observe some lessons and note whether what they saw when they used these instructional practice guides was different, or whether they saw things that they were convinced were really supportive of Common Core type learning that they couldn't find anywhere to put in my framework. That is, was the framework missing some important things? that should be there. So it's been a research question, and so therefore, then the question, the follow-up question would be, well, now, should the framework then be further modified in order to accommodate these things? That's where we are right now. This has been a project this whole school year. They've been collecting the data. We've had some researchers doing both qualitative as well as quantitative research, and lots of surveys and so on. So it's pretty interesting what's coming out of it. And so, but what we found was that those initial questions really weren't sufficient because we initially thought we were just answering the question about the framework instrument from 2013. But we decided it's not just about the instrument, actually, because we make all kinds of other assumptions, such as, who's using it, actually? When somebody observes in a classroom, is that person a generalist? You normally say an elementary principal, or is it a special? Is it a literacy coach? Or is it a department chair? And does that matter in what they see? Well, I can't imagine it doesn't, right? So that's a question. For what purpose? Are you doing this observation for somehow to fit into an evaluation process, or is this part of a coaching exercise? That will almost certainly affect how it's used and what the conversation is like. And then what's the level of content and pedagogical expertise by that's sort of related for who is it? Is it a generalist principal, or is it a literacy coach? And how much do they know about what good teaching looks like in third grade reading, or high school French, or whatever it is? I think all of us on a gut level would say it matters. And especially at the upper levels of performance of teaching, it's gotta matter. But we don't really know this. And so we're actually trying to get another round of funding to do some validation study of whatever emerges from this and just sort of see whether, try to answer those questions actually. And then, so therefore, and based on what's above, is one instrument sufficient, or do you need lots of them? Like, do you need a specific elementary reading? Do you need a specific fourth grade reading, right? How detailed do you have? What's the grain size? And we've had absolutely conflicting advice on this point, as you can imagine. The principals say, well, good grief, and no. I mean, the answer is no. One instrument is plenty. That's all I can have. I don't want 18. Even though they're good, even though it would be useful for fourth grade reading to have something that's really about fourth grade reading, no. The teachers or the instructional coaches take a little different view. They say, well, of course, what's not to like about having something that's really valid for this particular situation? So I'd be very interested in your views on that as well. But this is the age of technology. I can imagine a single observation tool that used for coaching, by the way, that is generic, but it has in it like click here for fourth grade math examples, right? Something like that, where you have a sort of embedded specificity that you go to if you need it. I don't know. We're still sorting all this out. So, but that's the state of play. But just so you know, even before I was working on the 2013, I noticed, and this was not accidental, that the big ideas around Common Core have always been part, or at least implicitly part, of the framework for teaching. Conceptual understanding has always been there. That's a big item in Common Core, high level. Intellectual rigor and reason has always been there. Always been there. Precision in thought and language. This was not there, well, a little bit, but I strengthened it but in the version that's now called the 2013. That is, to make sure that kids are using academic language correctly, and teachers, first of all, using academic language correctly, and are explicitly teaching that language to students. And that's a fairly big concept in Common Core. I haven't read anything about why, but my own background suggests that we do know that thought and language are inextricably intertwined, and that if you have imprecise use of language, you probably have imprecise thought. And so it's a way to unmuddle people's thinking, to be clear about the language. What do you actually mean? analysis and development logical. The argumentation angle in the Common Core is extremely strong and important. We have tended to not emphasize that in most schools. Like, help me understand why you think X, and do you agree with her thinking, and so on. And and logic fits into there. It also is about premises, understanding the what are the underlying premises of that argument. That was never strongly in the framework, and I did strengthen it for 2013. It should be there. Strategic thinking. And that's related to metacognition, of course, right? That is, okay, here's a math problem. What are my possible strategies for doing it? And by the way, I tried it that way and it didn't work, so I have to back it up and try another way. That kind of strategic thinking is embedded all through the Common Core. And then, of course, things about student controls, perseverance, and responsibility for learning. Those have always been at the upper levels of performance in the framework. For the distinguished level, it's a lot about student assumption and responsibility. So these are the big ideas related to all the subjects and levels in the framework and then in Common Core. So the question then is, so do you play these out one at a time at each level? But there are also, so here's what I did then I looked at the framework and sort of identified things in red, the places where the Common Core instructional practices would seem to be most critical. And you can see where it is. It's a lot of domains 1 and 3, not surprisingly, right? It's where the planning and the actual teaching happen. And the Common Core is all about content. It's not much about relationships. Now, I'm very interested in domain 2, except for the culture for learning, which sort of wants to be in domain 3 anyway. The Common Core doesn't have a lot to say about routines and procedures and about even interactions. The framework has a lot to say about those things because I think we all recognize that those are preconditions for good teaching, and absolutely the relationships. When we do our training exercises and ask people to identify memorable teachers, it's all about 2A. That is, a teacher who believed in me, who thought I was smart. That is, there are times when those relationships have turned people's lives around. And when you think about your most memorable teachers, it's not usually about algebra, right? Almost always. It might not even be mostly about history, right? That's right. So, okay. Wait a minute. He's a little button. Okay. So we've been working on these questions, and I've basically mentioned these, given as generic, specific, and so on. But there are these other challenges too, and I'd be curious to hear your comments on these. That there's curriculum work to be done, huge amounts of curriculum, and I think there's an outstanding question about who should do that work. I don't think it's the work of every teacher, right? But somebody's got to do that work. Like, okay, is this what we want our kids to be learning by the end of 5th grade? How do we get there? And it's a depth of teacher knowledge. I hesitate to even say that out loud because I don't mean it to be critical. But, these are part of it. And when I sort of said jokingly earlier, I want a microcast test based on, I mean that. I mean that. And I would imagine a lot of teachers would have that same reaction. Like, oh my gosh, what? I'm not sure I can do that. So that's not a trivial matter. And it could be that we have to drill down into some really hardcore content work with all teachers. Kids coming into 5th grade, they didn't have the benefit of grids K through 4 on what's in those standards, so they're not actually, many of them probably ready for 5th grade. This is not a trivial matter. The Common Core people don't seem to have actually noticed that. I mean, that's like when my dad says if we were a sensible country, we would die over 12 years. That's what he was getting at. And of course, it's a fair point. So that's why I think there's going to be something hitting the fan here before too long. And then teachers, many of us did not, in our own teacher training, didn't learn how to teach to these higher levels, the conceptual understanding and argumentation. We just didn't. And since it's so important, we do have to learn it. And supervisors need to know what it looks like. Well, there's another little bottleneck. And so, I mean, I just think that it's a capacity problem all over the place. And my fear around teacher evaluation is that all this will become high stakes for teachers before we've done the capacity building work. I'm worried. And it's so hard to know how to bring that up with policy people without them having the reaction, oh, well, you know, teachers are just being resistant or something. Well, they are, but they've got a reason to be. So I don't know how to play that out politically, and I hope some smart politics people can do that, because I do think that, I mean, I've never known, even in the unions, I work with the union folks, they're not opposed to this, they just want it to be fair, and it's got to be respectful, and do I hate teacher evaluation, that's why. Because I see a lot of people paying the price for ill thought out. And it's not as though the aims aren't the right ones and they're not well intentioned. It's just that along the way we're going to have corpses. Right? So in the last 3 minutes I have, or 2 minutes, this is the last thing I want to show you, and it's very early days of thinking, and let me just quickly explain what the boxes are. What I'm thinking is that we have, in any good evaluation system, we've got two strands. We've got quality assurance, and we have professional learning. And this strand has to be done well, right? And especially right here. For your first couple of years of teaching, if I'm a superintendent, my job is to know that I hired the right people. And the right people means they are teaching at least at a certain level of skill. And in my book, it might not be yours, but in my book, they have also demonstrated a commitment to ongoing learning. That they're committed to this. They want to continue getting better in this really complex work, and they're not just coasting, right? They're not going to just coast. Okay, so, and they are supported, by the way, in those first few years by a mentoring program. Now, this is the PD side, and so, but they link right there. Very, very importantly. So a new teacher has a mentor who's not an evaluator, and we could have a conversation about that today too. But that the evaluator here is trained and certified to make what is a very, very important decision. So it's effectively a lifetime appointment, really. Okay, so, but once somebody's crossed this threshold, and in some places you could call it tenure or just, you know, a threshold, then the individual teacher, then shifts into here. And so from then on, what they do with their colleagues, with literacy coaches, and this is the role, this whole string here, mentors and then literacy coaches, colleagues, this is where teacher leaders play such a crucial role. In my view, this is where the capacity gets built. That's good. Now over here, there still has to be some quality assurance that goes on. That is, you need periodic assessment. You need to make sure that teachers haven't fallen below some important threshold and are you know, just not performing well, and or gone asleep at the switch. And you need systems for that. But you don't have to do it to the 13th decimal point, and you probably don't have to do inspections of every teacher every year. I mean, you can have more imaginative systems over here that, and by the way, we have had some of those in the past. We just didn't do the other side very well, right? So I'm really, my own thing on this is, let's get teacher evaluation off the front page. Let's keep it in its place, know that it has a place, a very important place, very important role to play to ensure baseline quality, and then let's let it get out of the way and do the real work of teach learn and build.
So Charlotte, I know that we're out of time, but you've posed some great questions. Do you think that it might be possible to do a webinar where these folks could think about the questions that you posed, and then we could get together virtually, and they could provide some Thank you so much. Okay, we have 15 minutes before our next set of concurrent sessions. Gosh, I don't know how you're going to make a choice which one of these to go to. Angela Duckworth on grid, Richard Roberts on non-cogs. Tough decision here. I forgot to mention earlier, we will be drawing the winners for the scholarship items that we brought from our states for the scholarship fund at 4:15. You have this break and the next break and the break after lunch to buy your tickets and distribute them. After that, we're going to pull them. Joe?
Also, there's a change in the bulletin for the 10:40.